The 2024 college football season is just around the corner, so I'm joined by college football insider Brett McMurphy and betting analyst Collin Wilson to discuss their preseason rankings. And if you don't already know, Brett McMurphy is an AP voter. His voting and rankings are made public every single week on the Action Network website. And to counter, Collin Wilson is in charge of creating our weekly power ratings here at Action Network, trying to accurately judge the true quality of a team without any public perception involved. So this is how it's going to work. We're going to go through everybody's, Brett's and Collin's top 25. We're going to break down some of the interesting teams like Ole Miss, who they may have at number 1 because there's a little bit of a difference there, and then maybe a sleeper team to make the college football playoffs. So let's start with Brett McMurphy's top 5. And if you didn't notice by looking at the AP top 25 entering the season, there's a little 1 next to Oregon's name, and that is Mr. McMurphy. He has the Ducks led by Oklahoma transfer Dillon Gabriel atop the college football ranks. Next up, Georgia at number 2, the favorites to win the national championship, followed by Ohio State, Texas, and Bama rounding out the top 5. Now, Brett, I do want to ask you, I want you to explain to the viewers, because you're the only one here among all the AP voters with Oregon in that number 1 spot. I love being different. I love the look here. And I think there's a real argument to be made that the Ducks are the most talented team in the country. So please tell me more.
It wasn't basically, I want to do something different. You can make an argument for Georgia and Ohio State. I just really like what Dan Lanning's doing at Oregon. He talked at Big Ten Media Days about how important the trenches are. Oregon's going to have one of the best offensive and defensive lines in the country, which is imperative to compete for a national championship. He's got the SEC background coming from Georgia. He knows what it takes. I know it's easy to say, well, if you don't include a couple of games last year, look at what they would have done. But anyway, I'm going to say if you don't include their 2 games against Washington, 3-point losses, which they could have easily won, but they didn't. You look at their other 12 wins. They had an average winning margin of 32 points. They outgained the opponents by 250 yards. They simply dominated. I think that continues this year. Look, they don't even have to win the Big Ten. They'll be in the playoff. They get Ohio State in Eugene in mid-October. That will be a monster game. But I just like Oregon overall. They've got 11 returning starters, top 6 recruiting class. I like what they do offensively, and like what Lanning told me in Indianapolis, we're going to do something different. I don't know if the Big Ten's ready for us, but we're going to bring something different to the Big Ten, combine that all together, and that's why the Ducks are number 1 on my AP ballot.
Right. The Oregon doesn't lose too much year over year. Obviously, Bo Nix out, but they replaced that with someone just as good as him, maybe a little bit better, Dillon Gabriel. We'll see how that goes. But obviously, Brett going Oregon number 1. Collin's power ratings does not have Oregon number 1. They, in fact, and if we take a look, they have Georgia, the Bulldogs, coming in at number 1. Ohio State also enters the season higher than Oregon, followed by Penn State or Texas at number 4, and Penn State rounding out the top 5. Maybe James Franklin can finally make the CFP thanks to that expansion over there in the college football playoffs. But Collin, I do want to ask you about your top 5, how you got these 5 in particular, and why you have the Bulldogs and even Ohio State ahead of Oregon.
Yeah, I mean, Georgia is the best team in the nation from a power rating perspective. I think any odds maker out there would tell you that. It doesn't matter. They'd be 2.5-point favorites against Ohio State on a neutral right now. They'd be 58.5-point favorites over Kennesaw State, the worst team in FBS. I don't really have a problem with Brett taking Oregon number 1. I would make that game Georgia -4 on a neutral, and I would probably end up betting the Ducks because they do have it in the trench. They're ready for Big Ten play. And they are one of maybe 3 or 4 teams that have the most electric set of skill players at wide receiver and at running back. And then, I don't really have a problem with Alabama being in Brett's top 5. They're 6th in mine. I make them a 0.5 point off of Penn State. So if they played each other on a neutral, it would essentially be a pick 'em. And I think I'm one of the higher, people in the entire market that is high on Alabama. A lot of people think there's going to be a drop off, and I don't.
Yeah, I'm curious to see what happens with Alabama. I like Milroe, and I think the next year leap that he can make is going to be a big one here. But it'll be interesting to see how this top 5 rounds out, how they end up finishing, and obviously James Franklin, if he can beat the Ohio States and the Michigans of the world, because he's proven he's been unable to do that year over year. But let's take a look at Brett's next top 10 now. So from the 6 to the 15 range, the public darlings entering the season, it feels like everybody is on Ole Miss in some sort of fashion. They're coming in at number 6. Jackson Dart's a Heisman hopeful, and everyone seems to be sipping that Lane Kiffin juice. thanks to a star-studded transfer class. Penn State coming in at number 7, and perhaps most notable from the list, Miami is the first team out of the ACC at number 8. Clemson and Florida State sit at 13 and 15th, respectively. And Brett, I want to ask you a little bit more about Ole Miss. It feels fair that Dart has a realistic shot at winning the Heisman. They obviously come in with the number 1 transfer class in the country. I know everyone's so in on them. They haven't been. Lane Kiffin has proven he hasn't been able to beat, the big dogs of the SEC yet. But why do you have them 6th in particular? And do you see them potentially giving them Alabama and Georgia a run for their money?
I mean, Charlie, the talent's there. The question is, can they live up to the expectations?
Right.
Kiffin is already borrowing a phrase from Nick Saban about rat poison. Ole Miss has never had these high of expectations. They're coming off a 10-win season. The last coach that won back-to-back 10-win seasons, they named the stadium after him, John Vaught. So this is unprecedented waters for the Rebels. You mentioned Jackson Dart. Obviously, that's key for Ole Miss. I think why I've got them as high as I do is you mentioned the transfers they bring in. They bring in 11 transfers that were starters at other Power 5 schools. How do those guys mesh in with the current guys? I think that's the key. I think they have a real chance to compete with Alabama, with Georgia. You throw in Texas there, and possibly get to an SEC title game. But it is a real thing to it's the cliche that you're the hunted, not the hunter. How will they respond to this when everyone's coming at them, when they're getting everyone's best shot? And also you add in the new SEC with adding Oklahoma and Texas. Suddenly you look at Ole Miss's schedule, and now they're, besides playing LSU and Georgia, they also have Oklahoma on the schedule. So the schedule's a lot tougher. But certainly this is the most talented team that Kiffin has had in Oxford.
Right, and obviously Dart manning that quarterback, a Heisman hopeful. And it'll be interesting. If Lane Kiffin can get them deep in the CFP, we might get the Lane Kiffin training facility next door to that field. But Collin, I want to ask you, without looking at your next 10 right now, Ole Miss is outside of your top 10 in the power ratings. Why are they in particularly missing the cut here, and why do you have them outside?
I think this is the fun of an AP top 25 vote and a power ratings, because in a power rating world, you could be 7 spots from another position, say 4th, and you could only be 2 points on the field. It would matter from an odds maker perspective. And that's what we have here with Ole Miss. I have them exactly tied with Iowa State. I have them a half point behind 9th place team, Florida State. So it's very even right there. And I will remind everybody that the portal does not win championships for teams. There was a couple of voters in the AP that put them number 4. I mean, that is lofty expectations. And you go back and look at USC with Caleb Williams. You look at LSU pulling Jaden Daniels and all the weapons that those teams put around them. Those teams didn't win conference championships. Those teams didn't win national championships. What they do, the transfer portal is good for building depth. It's not good for building championships. But Ole Miss has to close the gap here on Georgia. They just lost by 35 points. The Bulldogs put up a 50-burger on them last year. These are the same coaching staffs. And yes, Jackson Dart is still the same quarterback. He's going to have to look at the Bulldogs at some point. And I think one important thing about Jackson Dart is I think he is the best bet of this whole entire Ole Miss portfolio that you could bet on, from win totals to conference championships. Jackson Dart, if they are to make 10 wins and they are to make the playoff for Ole Miss, he should have a seat in New York as at least a very strong contender to win the Heisman. And the reason is because of how much weapons that he has around him, some of the most ridiculous skills of any of you could get in the portal. He has at wide receiver. And also with Jackson Dart last year, his efficiency on passes from 10 to 19 yards and in a crowded pocket exploded. He is light years ahead of where he started off at USC. So if Jackson Dart continues that progression, he is absolutely going to have a seat in New York at the end of the season. Yeah,
you stole the follow-up question right out of my mouth. I was going to ask you, if you want to bet into this Ole Miss, if you want to bet into the potential of this team, is it looking at Jackson Dart? And it really does feel like that. Their offense is shaping up to be one of the most dynamic in all of college football. I'm going to be dabbling in some Jackson Dart Heisman futures, maybe some Milroe too. I think whatever team comes out of the SEC, a lot of them are going to have a seat in New York. But let's look at Collin's next top 10. I hinted at Ole Miss not making the top 10. Let's take a look. Alabama comes in at number 6, followed by your defending national champions, Michigan at number 7. I mentioned Brett having Miami at 8. Florida State is his power ratings number 1 ACC school. That's coming in at number 9, and then Clemson in the 15. Miami didn't even make that top 15 this first go around. Collin, you mentioned the beauty of AP poll and the power ratings and how there can be so many differences. Michigan is the team that first comes to mind when I look at your list. They're number 7. We'll talk about where Brett has them just in a little bit, but it seems like no Harbaugh, no JJ McCarthy, the national championship team, a lot of them are gone. They don't even have a starting quarterback named yet. They're still figuring that all out. Why Michigan in the top 10?
Well, at the end of last season when they won the national championship, they were evenly power rated with Georgia. If they would have played Georgia, it would have been a neutral game. It would have been a pick'em. And so you have to see what did we do in the offseason? Well, we docked them 6 points on their power rating over the offseason. That was due to a lot of losses on the offensive side of the ball, a little bit of coordinator changes coming in with Wink Martindale as the DC, but that doesn't change scheme. And it's not going to change personnel on either side of the ball, especially with Sharon Moore being the head coach now. So the public perception is this team doesn't have a quarterback. While that's true, they still have a vicious rush attack on the ground. They still have a defensive line that is one of the best in the nation. It may be rotating names that you haven't seen before, but it's still good old Michigan that's produced names like Aiden Hutchinson and put them into the NFL. And so the perception is, yes, we docked them 6 points. We moved them down, but not extreme enough to where we're going to say that, they're a 15 or 20 or 25 team, because when you get to that point in the power ratings, you're looking at teams like Oklahoma State and Auburn and SMU, and that is not where Michigan is. They are much higher from a power rating perspective.
Well, I'm going to kick it right to Brett then, because, without giving away the rest of his rankings, Brett, you have Michigan at 17th in your AP poll. Why do you have them so much lower than, say, power ratings at 7th here?
I'm smarter than Collin, basically. That's the main reason. Look, what Collin says is 100% true, but there's a lot of things you have to take into consideration. They lost some players. They lost 13 players to the NFL draft. They lost Harbaugh. They are running the same offense. They don't have the same talent. There is questions at quarterback. And the way Collin described them, and I've heard other people describe them this way, great defense. We don't know what they're going to do offensively. It kind of reminds me of Iowa last year. I don't think they're going to be that offensively challenged, but they are going to struggle. Their win total opened up 9.5. Looking at their schedule, they're automatically underdogs in 3 games, toss-ups, and 2 or 3 more. I think there's going to be a big drop. I think it's going to be similar to TCU last year, coming off the national title appearance. And also, while what's going on with the NCAA notice of allegations regarding not the Spygate, but illegal recruiting during the COVID period, basically every current member on the staff has been named in that thing. That's not going to impact them day to day, but I think once the season wears on and they start suffering some losses, and then kind of people realize, hey, this is going to be a different Michigan team, I think that's going to weigh on them and it's going to impact them. And I think all of that just snowballs into the fact that I don't think Michigan's a top 10 team. In the last 20 years, there's been at least one team every year except one that started in the top 10, ranked in the top 10, finished the year unranked. I think Michigan could be that team.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see what happens here, and obviously circle that week 2 matchup. But I will say, you mentioned the Michigan quarterback problems. I don't think they're going to be as bad as Iowa. I don't think there's going to be like a Craigslist ad saying we need someone to come over and lead this team to play quarterback, because that's close to what Iowa was doing last year. But I talked about Michigan being outside of Brett's top 15. Let's take a look at the rest of his rankings here. And Oklahoma has taken the number 16 spot, followed by Michigan at 17, Tennessee 18, Iowa 19. You can read the rest. But the other team that I do want to circle here, LSU at number 20. And mostly because why I circle them in particular here is another going back to Collin's rankings as well. LSU has such a stark difference between you two. Brett, you have them at 20th. Collin, you have them in the top 10. Brett, I'm curious about you with this one. Obviously, they have to replace both their coordinators. Jaden Daniels is out as quarterback. Now comes in Nussmeier. Is that what kind of led to their drop-off, is that you just don't know if they're going to fully take that next step again?
Yeah, that's part of it. And look, I know Collin's really high on the Nuss bus, but I think there is going to be some drop there, and you're replacing both coordinators. That's going to be a challenge. This doesn't come into where I rank people, but just looking at their schedule, we get to the end of the year, they're going to be fortunate, I think, to have 8 wins. USC, Ole Miss, A&M, Alabama, Florida, and Oklahoma. Certainly those are all monster games. We'll have to see how they end up coming out the other end. Look, the good news for LSU is you look at Brian Kelly's history and everywhere he's been before as a head coach. Central Michigan, Cincinnati, Notre Dame. What's happened in year 3? He has had unbelievable success compared with the rest of his career. He's gone 33-5 in those third-year seasons. And he told me in Dallas that he actually believes this team has a lot of similarities to some of these other teams that had a great deal of success in year 3. So I think that's a positive. Maybe I'm undervaluing them a little bit, but I just think, losing the coordinators and obviously Daniels is going to be tough because LSU won a lot of shootouts last year. They just outscored people with Daniels. I don't know if they can do that initially with Nussmeier in there replacing Daniels.
And Collin, I'll kick it right to you. Kelly said this is the deepest team they've had in years, despite losing the Heisman winner under center. Doesn't seem like the power ratings in particular are down on LSU despite the coordinator changes and the quarterback change.
Yeah, I mean, LSU took home positive power rating changes in the offseason, and it was a team that I thought was going to take negative bumps, and they didn't. When you go into the stats on defense, they return more than 80% of their pass breakups and stops, which is one of the most critical categories of stats inside of PFF. And when you give them a little bump because of that, then you go and visit the coordinator changes and you say, well, on offensively, they just promoted from within as Mike Denbrock left and went to Notre Dame. They're running the exact same offense. They're just going to tweak it a little bit on the run-pass ratio with Nussmeier under center instead of Jaden Daniels. And then you go on the defensive side, and I have no love for Missouri's defensive coordinator, Blake Baker, making his way down to Baton Rouge. I had problems with a lot of things on the Missouri defense. It was very leaky, especially in the red zone. But where was the bar on this LSU team last year? They were giving up 40 to everybody on their schedule. It was an abomination. The bar is so low that even Blake Baker from Missouri can get over it. And then as many people like bark about the power ratings, I would make LSU and USC, who were playing each other in the very first game of the season, I would make it 4.5. It's 6 in the market now in favor of LSU. So we are right there with where the odds makers make it.
Yeah, this is the beauty of looking at how the power ratings differ from how the public and the AP poll differs as well. But let's take a look at Collin's rest of his top 25 list. You mentioned USC. They come in at 19th here. Miami, who Brett is very high on, at 21st. And, of course, his Cowboys, Oklahoma State, down at 22, followed by Kansas, Louisville, and Auburn, rounding out that top 25 on his power ratings here. But Collin and Brett, I'm going to ask each of you a question. Collin, you're going to go first. A sleeper team to make the college football playoffs. You, in particular, Collin, are targeting a team that's not even on that full screen we just showed.
Right. SMU plus 1,100, 11-1 on the Ponies joining the ACC. Look, the Mustangs are going to be favored by double digits, nearly double digits in 10 games. That is amazing. I mean, this is one of the softest schedules in the nation for a power conference team. They dodge just about anybody that's heavy. There is a little bit of a struggle in the middle of the schedule with Florida State and Louisville. I don't expect them to beat them because there's such a mismatch in the trench with the size and the experience. But SMU and Rhett Lashlee have been hitting the portal hard for 2 years to build this team. They are electric on offense. They were top 10 in everything in defense despite the competition last year. So 10 wins is their ceiling. 9 wins, I think I would play their over. I think their over has way more room to run. There is a lot of value on them to win the ACC, and 11-1 to make the playoff. You're a 10-win team in the ACC. You're making the playoff.
And obviously, just a reminder, go listen to the BBOC podcast because Collin, Stuckey, all the guys over there have been breaking down conference by conference. Subscribe to our new YouTube channel, college football, basketball, college only over there. So right now they're all chugging through all the conference previews. But Brett, take us home with your sleeper to make the college football playoff.
Well, I mean, based on my ballot, they're not a sleeper, but based on everybody else's opinion, they are a sleeper, and that's Miami. I have them ranked number 8. I have them ranked higher than anybody. I ranked Oregon higher than anybody. I ranked Miami ranked higher than anybody. At the end of the year, we can come back on here and you can tell me what a genius I am. Look, I'm drinking the Kool-Aid with the Hurricanes. I know we can talk about all the late game issues with Mario Cristobal at Miami and at Oregon, but forget about that for a second. They brought in the best quarterback running back transfer duo in Cam Ward and Damian Martinez from the 2-pack conference. They also are loaded in the trenches, kind of like Oregon. Cristobal is an offensive line guy. He told me this is the best offensive line they've had since he's been at Miami. Another comparison is Cristobal kind of believes that this kind of has the same vibe, the same feel that he had in year 3 at Oregon. First year as a defensive coordinator, then 2 years as a head coach. What happened his third year at Oregon? 12 wins, won the Rose Bowl. I think they can have the same type of success this year. I think it would be a huge disappointment if they don't get to the playoff. I think winning the ACC title is a possibility, which it's ironic to say because Miami's been in the ACC 21 years and they've got as many ACC titles as everybody doing the show right now. 0. I think this is finally the year they break through. They are so talented. They've made a lot of gains in the transfer portal, and the schedule sets up nicely. The key for Miami, I don't care that it's a non-conference game. They have to win at Florida. If they don't win at Florida, then the sky's falling and everything collapses. If they get past Florida, the schedule sets up great. They have a tricky trip at Virginia Tech in September, and then back-to-back home games against Louisville and FSU. So they should be able to have a successful season. Keyword is should, and will the Canes finally deliver?
In just a couple weeks, we'll have a check-in. We'll be able to see if the sky is falling, if your sleeper team's already just completely out of that top 25 falling down. But also interesting to note, you mentioned Cam Ward and the transfer, him coming over to Miami. We talked about Jackson Dart and the ceiling of Ole Miss. Could be a potential Heisman look for Cam Ward as well if Miami is able to live up to the expectations that Brett sets. But this is the beauty of the AP poll, the power ratings. You get to see the differences here. Teams like Michigan, teams like Ole Miss, they come in a little bit different, and only time will tell. So that wraps up our Brett and Collin's preseason rankings. You can check out every week. They have Brett, the AP poll, Collin, the power ratings, on theactionnetwork.com. And also make sure to like this video, subscribe to the new BBOC YouTube channel, and tune in every week to hear from both Brett and Collin on the BBOC podcast. Have a great day.